Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Corsair H100i RGB PRO XT. And in this video I'm going to be showing you how to set up this all-in-one cooler with various different Intel builds, showing the various steps for doing it, what you need to do, where you need to plug things in, and more. I'm also going to be demonstrating how to swap out the standard fans for some others. So in this build I'm going to be swapping them out for Noctua's fans. I will be showing you the standard setup process on how to do it with the standard fans and talking about that, but I'm also going to show you how and why you could swap out for other fans. Now I've done this separately and previously with Corsair's QL120 RGB fans, and that was a bit more complicated, but obviously added RGB into the case, into the mix, and that is one of the things that you can do. So you can swap out the standard fans if you wish. This all-in-one cooler only has RGB on the pump head, so although it's marked as RGB, the fans that come with it do not have RGB lighting, so that you'll notice that all I have is the pump head in the 4000D airflow and the RAM, and that's the only bits that have RGB lighting on them. But this is in an Intel setup with various different sockets. This is actually LGA 2066, but I'm also going to cover LGA 1200 and LGA 1700 in this guide, so stick with me to find out all the things you need to know about that and the setup process for this. Now, this is an affordable cooler, 240mm, so two 120mm fans included as standard that you can see here. Now obviously these are good airflow fans that are designed to give good airflow through the all-in-one cooler, but they aren't particularly fancy looking, and so I'm upgrading them with Noctua's fans because they're known for being better cooling, and I want to make the most of the airflow in the case. However, it isn't necessary. You could just use these fans. I just wanted to demonstrate the different things that you can do with it. Now obviously this all-in-one cooler works with Intel, as I said already, but it will also work with AMD, and there are a number of different brackets in here for such a setup. I am not going to cover AMD in this guide though, so just bear that in mind. Things to note about this as well is it is a all-in-one cooler, which means it is pre-installed with coolant inside. You do not need to fill it up. It also has pre-applied thermal paste on the pump head, so you don't need thermal paste either. That's the joy of something like this. Really easy to set up, very simple to install because everything's done for you for the most part. The other thing about this one is it's really easy to control the fans directly from the pump as well, and I'll talk about why in a minute. So in the box you can see you get a variety of different things. There are some included brackets. It comes pre-installed with the Intel brackets on the pump head, and you also get some separate AMD ones. So you'd swap out the ones that are pre-installed on that pump head for these if you required an AMD install, and then there are some different standoff screws and things as well. In the box you also get a backplate for Intel setups that you need and various things, and another bracket that you can use for AMD. So I'm going to move those out of the way to avoid confusion, but here's the backplate that you need. Now this actually sits in different positions depending on which socket of motherboard you're using, so I'll talk a bit more about that later on. And then you have a micro USB cable that plugs into the pump head and then into your motherboard, and I'll show you where. The little tiny bag has a variety of screws in it, including some very long ones and some short ones with washers and then thumb screws. So we obviously need to go through the process of separating those out. There are a number of different standoff screws, and it's worth referring to the manual, but I'll also talk about which ones you need for which socket of motherboards so that you're aware of that. So we'll talk a bit more about all that later on. For now, you'll notice that multiple different cables are coming out of the pump head. So you can see there's a flat one, that's for SATA power. There's two other breakout cables that are for the fan power. And then there's another cable that connects up to the AIO pump header or CPU fan header on your motherboard. And I'll show you where later on. These two are particularly interesting because they come out from the pump head and they connect up to the fans. So it means you can connect two fans to this pump with ease. And that means that the all-in-one cooler essentially has control over not only the pump but also the fans. Makes life a lot simpler. You don't need to worry about any sort of control box or any other extra controls or power or where to plug those in, because normally they'd plug into like a Commander Pro if you had a fancier setup, or perhaps directly to motherboard headers. this makes it a lot more straightforward. Now the next thing to do is to think about where you're going to position the all-in-one cooler, how you're going to position it in the case, and suss out the setup. I'm going to go for roughly this setup here, which is where the radiator is mounted on top of the case and then the pump is going to sit below it. You can do that in either direction, so you could have it this way around so that the tubes are at the back of the case. This is depending on your personal preference and the aesthetic. However, it is a bit more awkward to do because of the way the pump tubes work. They're a bit more difficult to manipulate, but it is going to depend on your setup and the aesthetic that you're trying to achieve. There's nothing wrong with either of these. One of the things you will know is the cables come out the top of the pump head and then you can run them to the back of the motherboard, so that makes life easier. Another option is to front mount the all-in-one radiator. Now you can do this depending on the size of your case. Obviously, if it takes a 240mm radiator, you could do it on the front. I personally don't think this is a good idea because I personally prefer to intake air through the front of the case where possible, but it really depends on your case setup and how you do it. Now you will find a number of people telling you you can't set it up that way with the tubes at the top. That is actually incorrect. I've done a video on that separately that I'll link to in the description that explains a bit more about it. But one of the things I would say is don't mount it on the bottom of your case. Basically, you need to avoid having the pump head above the radiator at the top point. So you don't want the pump at the highest point because that can result in long-term problems. Now in terms of mounting the fans, this is going to depend on your setup in your case, but basically fans are designed so that air is pulled through the front and exhausted out the rear. So where the stickers are on the back, that's where the air is going to come through from. So in this case, because I'm basically mounting it on the top of the case, I'm going to try and exhaust air through the radiator and out the top, which means putting them with their back down onto the rad. That then pulls air through from the case, out over the rad, and then exhausts it out. And so two things to bear in mind there. One, the position of the fans, so making sure you position them correctly. And two, to make sure that you've got your cables facing the right way, because you basically want to run those to the back of the case so that they're hidden and out of the way and not an eyesore. More on that a bit later on, because I actually made a small mistake here, which you will see me rectify later. But essentially what we're doing is trying to set it up so everything's nice and neat. So you can see we've got some of it set up now, and the process here is fairly straightforward because essentially what we just need to do is connect up those fans to the pump head once it's all installed, and then everything will run nicely. Now there are a lot of things going on in the box still, so it might seem a bit intimidating, but don't worry, because the process is actually a lot more straightforward. Now this is the micro USB cable again, that plugs into the side of the pump. It's very important to remember to do this. Plug this in before you go about the installation process, so you don't need to worry about messing about trying to plug it in afterwards, because it is a little bit fiddly. That USB cable will then run to the bottom of your motherboard and plug into a USB header on the motherboard, and I'll show you where later. And then that gives you control over the pump head via CORSAIR's IQ software and allows you to monitor things. It also means that you can upgrade the firmware on it, which you may well find is necessary, because I certainly did. And you can do that from CORSAIR's IQ as well. Now in the box you'll find a number of different standoff screws. These are what's used to connect the pump to the motherboard, and you'll see there's a variety of different sizes. In the manual you'll find reference to what is what, and then you can separate them out. There are some that are darker colour, so they are like a black instead of the gunmetal of the others. Those are AMD, so we can just move them out of the way. There's only 4 of them, and we move those out of the way. Then you'll notice that there are 2 different lots of Intel ones, so you can see that there are ones that are essentially shorter on one side than the other. Those are the LGA 2011 and 2066 standoffs. I'm going to be using those later on. And then on the left we have the LGA 1150, 1151, 1155 standoffs. Worth noting that those also work with 1200. More on that in a minute. Now if you have an LGA 1700 socket, I've done a video separately on this, but you will need a separate kit that you can get from CORSAIR. It essentially includes a backplate, and more importantly it also has different standoffs, because there are different standoffs. Now it's worth noting that this Strix motherboard that I'm using here is an LGA 1700 socket, but it has 2 different sizes of notch on it. So there's actually 2 different holes in each of the 4 points, which means that you can theoretically use an LGA 1200 setup on there, so you don't need this separate bracket. And I covered more about this in that separate video if you want to check it out. But if you get the extra attachment, essentially the setup process is roughly the same. So you'll see essentially you just need to put this back plate on the back of the motherboard, remove the 3M sticker so it'll stick to the back of it, and make sure the pins are in the four corners so that it passes through to the front, and then you can install the standoffs on it. I'd recommend doing this before installing your motherboard in the case if possible. It just makes life a bit easier because you can reach everything you need to without any hassle, and you can hold that back plate in place if necessary while putting the standoffs in, which makes life a bit simpler. But here you can see me installing the standoffs, so basically put those in each of the four corners, and you can see they are roughly the same size on each side, but they are just slightly different from the other ones that are included in the packet for the Corsair H100i RGB PRO XT. So you do need the extra ones, but only if you're installing on a motherboard that only has the LGA 1700 socket, because it's a slightly different setup, slightly different in its design, and if you use the wrong ones then you won't have proper contact between the pump head and the CPU, which then could result in problems. Once you've done that, obviously I'm just showing you the steps for doing it outside of the case. You wouldn't actually do this now, but basically we seat down the pump head on top of the CPU and then use the four thumb screws that are included to secure the pump head down. Now, as I said already, this has pre-applied thermal paste, so you don't need to worry about thermal paste, and it has the right amount, so you don't need to worry about how much or how little you need to use. Just pop it down on top and then secure it with the thumb screws. Take care not to over tighten because you could damage things, so be very gentle, but also obviously you need to make sure it's secure so there's a good contact between both of those. And then that's the final product. Now this is an LGA 1200 socket motherboard, so an older generation, but basically the same setup process. We're just going to use different standoff screws, so ever so slightly different. Now I haven't got a CPU installed here obviously at this point, but I am just going to show you the process for this because it's ever so slightly different. You will also notice that in the manual there's no reference to LGA 1200 because this is an older generation of all-in-one cooler. However, it does still work. What you need is the ones on the left hand side here, so the same as you'd use for LGA 1155 or 1150 is the ones you'd use for the LGA 1200. So again, the process is basically the same here. Flip the motherboard over and get access to the back of it, and then you just need to install the back plates. Now it's worth bearing in mind that these back plates are adjustable, so each of the pins can be pushed in or out in order to fit, and you'll find if you look closely on each of the edges that it tells you where the positioning is for where it should sit. Obviously you can also just adjust it until they fit into the holes. The 3M sticker is what holds it in place over the metal back plate, so that makes it a little bit easier to secure and make sure it's going to stay on there while you're going about the process of installing the standoffs. The standoffs is basically what's going to make sure there's a good solid contact there though, so you don't need to worry too much about it, but just making sure it's secure nicely on the back without over pressurizing that area. Once that's done, again, flip it back over and then go about installing those standoffs that I've already shown you and making sure they are secured and ready, each of the four corners. And again, you can see the difference between these, so ever so slightly different looking, and we're going about the process of setting those up and installing them now. Basically securing them in the four corners, and then the process is the same. Obviously, once the CPU is installed, making sure you seat down that all-in-one pump over the top. So we'd pop it down and then install it. Don't forget to remove the plastic cover, obviously. You need to make sure you take that off before you try and set it down, otherwise you will have some problems. Small points of note that are hopefully useful, and I'm going to show you some of the mistakes I made later on so that you're aware. But you can see that the process is basically the same for the majority of these installations. No matter what socket you're using, it's basically the same setup. The complexity perhaps comes in the cables, but don't worry because I'm going to show you the process for that. So as I said already, you have this single cable coming out next to the power cable. That connects up to either the AIO pump header or to the CPU fan header, depending on your motherboard. So you'll find those usually at the top right. I've seen one just below on the bottom left of the CPU previously, but you will notice them up here. So on this one, it's actually pump fan 1, but you also have CPU fan. You can generally use either of those. Obviously both the pump head and the CPU fans are being controlled. If there is a AIO pump or pump fan header on the motherboard at this area, then I'd recommend plugging it in there. The other one is that USB cable that I mentioned earlier on. That plugs into the bottom of the motherboard, and you can see them too marked here, USB, and you'll see that you can only plug it in one way, so it's impossible to plug this in incorrectly. I'm showing you the process for doing this outside of the case because it's a bit easier to show you where those things are. Obviously you'd actually do it once it's fully installed in the case. So that is the standard setup and a variety of motherboard sockets, and hopefully that made things a little bit straightforward. I'm actually going to show you on the LGA 2066 in a minute as well. So now I'm going about the process of taking off the standard fans that I've already installed and swapping them out for the Noctua fans. Now, Noctua's fans are renowned for running quietly and also having great airflow, so they're perfect for this sort of thing. And also because I just wanted to test what the airflow would be like in the 4000D with multiple Noctua fans. But you can use the included screws. There are quite a few of these, and enough to do push-pull actually, as a point of note. So if you wanted to set up fans on both sides, you could potentially do that. I am not, because it's not necessary really. I will be doing a video separately on the 4000D with this setup if you're curious about the airflow that comes from these Noctua fans. But the good thing here is that you can still connect up the power cables from those directly to the pump, so it makes life a lot easier in terms of the fan management. And that's one of the nicest things about this all-in-one cooler, is the ability to just plug cables in and not have to worry about extra control boxes and other things. And obviously without any RGB, that makes life a lot simpler as well. Now, a quick note on the SATA power. So that's the flat connector on the left now, and so what we need to do is plug that in directly to the power supply unit. Here I'm using the Corsair HX850, which is a bit older. I'm reusing some of my parts. I've done videos recently on the RM850 if you're interested and want to find out more about the setup of the power supply unit. But essentially we need one of these cables that has a daisy chainable flat connector that plugs into the peripheral and SATA power connector on your power supply unit. Essentially plugging that in there, and just to demonstrate what we do. So then you basically need to make sure once you've finished the setup process that you use this flat power connector and connect that up to the power supply unit. Obviously it gives power both to the pump and also to the fans, so it's essential that you plug it in so that the liquid will flow around inside the pump, but also the fans will spin in order to cool it all down. So there we have majority of the steps set up for that. Now obviously the installation process. So in this case you can fit a 240mm rad on the top. I could fit a 360mm rad on the front, that was an option, but I'm going to fit this on the top because I think that's the best setup for this case, and that's how I'm going to do it. But one of the things that you will notice there is that I was a bit silly and I put the fans on the wrong way around, so actually the cables are going to sit out the front, which isn't ideal. This is why it's important to pay attention to what you're doing and the thought of the process before you're going about it. It's actually worth sort of seating things or preparing to seat things in the case before you go about installing everything. Then you won't have to go through this process of realizing that you're a plonker and you need to remove things and turn them around. This is not a major issue, obviously. I haven't really caused any problems. I just need to swap the fans around so the cables are fitting the other way around. Obviously, depending on which way around you're doing it as well, the cable's going to face different ways. So if I was going to make it so that pump tubes were at the rear of the case, then it wouldn't have been a problem. But I wanted to put them towards the front. I just think it would be a better setup that way, personally. But it really depends on your setup, your PC, and what your RAM is, and whether you're worried about showing that off or not. So now we have it set up properly, and you'll notice that those cables now face the back, as they should, because then I can hide them away a bit nicer. And we're going to make sure that everything's ready to go. Now this is an LGA 2066 motherboard. It actually doesn't require a backplate. It has a backplate pre-installed on it. So this is i9-9980XE, so it's Extreme Edition CPU, and you'll notice that it has quite a big surround on it already. And here you can see the standoffs for that. So they are shorter on one side and longer on the other. You'll notice those in the manual from earlier on. I did demonstrate what they look like, and there's a close-up look at them and the installation for them. Again, same logic, but the backplate's already installed, so actually this is a much easier setup, and I wish it was the same with all the motherboards, but unfortunately it isn't. But we do need to make sure those standoffs are set up and ready to go. And then again, we'll just, same process, we're going to seat the pump down over the top. But first, we're going to install the radiator. So basically, mounting the radiator on the top of the case. Now, for this process, you need the smaller screws with the washers. So essentially, we're just going to fill in all the gaps and make sure that it's screwed in properly. You need to make sure you're positioning it in a good position as well. So you notice that there are a number of different points here where you could theoretically mount it. And that's because you can also use 140mm fans on here. So you could actually have a 280mm radiator instead of a 240. So slightly larger radiator. But you'll see that there are various different points for screwing it in. And there are loads of screws. So I'm just going to skip that process. But basically, washers and a screw for each of the points along here to make sure that it's well secured in place. Now, what I'd recommend is actually loosely fitting some of these at first, then checking to see where the position of the radiator is and that you're happy with it and that everything looks nice and neat and it isn't interfering with anything. And then you could obviously slide it back and forth until you're happy that it's in the position that you want, and then tighten those screws up so that it's fully screwed in and secured. When that makes it just a bit more straightforward in terms of the positioning, but I actually got it right and this is sort of the position I want. But if you find that your case is a different size and perhaps the tubes are in the way of the RAM, or the tubes are a bit close to one of the fans, for example, then this is one of the ways that you can do it. Once you've done that, then obviously run the cables from the fans to the rear so that they're just tucked out of the way and make things a bit neater. So you'll probably find some spots at the top where you can run those. And I managed to tuck mine out through the back. And then obviously, as I said already, make sure you secure that micro USB cable to the pump head. And again, we'll need to run that to the back and then to the bottom of the case. And that makes things a bit neater. So all the cables are essentially going to end up at the top, and we're going to run most of them, apart from that all-in-one pump header, as I said already. That will connect to the motherboard, but the rest of them can go to the back of the case and then get plugged into the various other things. Push the pump head down onto the CPU and then secure the thumb screws and just tighten each of those up. Make sure you secure those down nicely, and then we just need to run those cables through to the back as well. It can be a little bit fiddly, and one thing of note here is it's also a little bit tricky now to access the all-in-one pump header. This is going to vary depending on your case, but something to bear in mind. If the case is a bit smaller, you might well have trouble with the cable management and plugging things in. But you can see that I've ended up with the cables at the rear now, and I have the fan cables and the pump fan breakout cables at the rear as well, so I can connect everything up there. And then I have the flat SATA power cable, which I'm going to run from the bottom of the case from the power supply unit up through the channeling and then plug in there. So now we have all of that connected up, and that's most of it. But don't forget, we also need to run the USB cable as well, because that's very important. I'm running that down the right hand side here, or left, depending on which way around you're looking at it, and to the bottom. Don't forget that the USB connection is at the bottom of the motherboard, generally in the middle, so you'll find it roughly down there. Make sure that's all done. So now all the cables are connected and everything is ready to go. Now it's just a case of making sure that everything else is set up. Obviously your graphics card isn't in here, for example, at the moment. And then turning it on, booting into Windows and downloading IQ and installing the software there. From within that, then you will then have control over the fans and the pump and all the other things. But more importantly, you'll also be able to update the firmware if necessary, and to monitor temperatures and much more. Hopefully you found this video useful. Be sure to come back and check out the 4000D video with all the Noctua fans. Thanks for watching. This has been The Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.